You typed a question. ChatGPT gave an answer. But wait, what really just happened? According to philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein, you just entered a language game. What kind of game is this? Can you win or lose it? And what does ChatGPT think about it? Let's find out. In the 19th century, the idea that reason and science could lead humanity to freedom and prosperity grew stronger thanks to concrete achievements. In physics, Newtonian mechanics gave people the sense that the world could be described by strict and universal laws. Thermodynamics, electrodynamics, and astronomy developed, and everything looked like a single coherent picture of nature. The Industrial Revolution took place. Steam engines, railways, the telegraph appeared. In society, people could see for themselves that science not only explained the world, but radically changed life. In biology, Darwin explained the origin of species through evolution, without any appeal to the supernatural. This gave rise to the idea of science as a new religion. It would provide a solid foundation for society and morality. But in the 20th century, a crisis arrived. Einstein's discoveries shattered the perfect picture of Newton's mechanical universe. In mathematics, Gödel revealed the limits of formalization. And then the terrifying First World War drove the point home. Interestingly, Wittgenstein's own philosophy made the same shift from positivism in his early works to anti-systemic, anti-structuralist views later. Early Wittgenstein claimed it was possible to build a perfectly logical, transparent language that could scientifically and precisely reflect the facts of the world. Moreover, he argued this so convincingly in his Tractatus Logica Philosophicus that he inspired the Vienna Circle and the logical positivists to analyze the language of science and cleanse it of metaphysics. But later Wittgenstein essentially said that all of this was nonsense. Searching for a universal essence of language was pointless. What's actually useful, he argued, is studying how language functions in real life, in practice. And it's in this later period that he introduced the concept of the language game. A language game is a set of rules, practices and situations in which language is used. Language is no longer a mirror of the world, but a tool for action. And a very multifunctional tool at that. I would compare it to a smartphone, which can be a phone, a navigator or a music player, depending on what you need from it. It's not one device with a universal essence, but a platform for many practices. The same goes for language. Notice how differently you use words, intonation and even syntax in a request, an order, a story, a prayer or a scientific explanation. These are different language games, and the meaning of words shifts the game. Just like the meaning of a ball and what you can do with it is completely different in football, volleyball or baseball. When you interact with ChatGPT, that too is a language game in Wittgenstein's sense. Your interaction follows rules. You ask questions, the chat replies. We use specific formats: text, clarifications, quotations. In broad terms, it's closest to the games of explaining or teacher-student, but at the same time it's unique. The interlocutor is not a human being, but a system trained on a human language. Words and phrases here acquire meaning only within this practice. The situation itself matters. You type and send a message, and then the chat sends you a single reply, always only in response. There is another key idea from late Wittgenstein that helps us understand what's happening when we talk to ChatGPT. It's the formula: language is rooted in forms of life. This means that to grasp the meaning of a word, one must look not only at the rules of language, but also at the form of life in which it is used. In other words, language is not an abstract system, but a part of practice, daily life and culture. A form of life is the ensemble of human habits, ways of acting, social norms and traditions. Our form of life here is the digital culture of the 21st century, where a person can hold a philosophical dialogue with artificial intelligence. This is a new space, but it continues old practices: teacher-student, dialogue, reflection. And the conversation with ChatGPT itself is a new kind of language game with rules such as question-answer, the shared goal that can be described as clarification of meaning, learning, or collaborative exploration. The meaning of words is defined within this very practice, and this practice is embedded in our contemporary form of life, digital communication. So you decided to enter the game. In fact, it's not one single game, there are hundreds of different ones. Each of your prompts sets new rules. Each task is a signal: now we are playing this way. The meaning of words doesn't come from the AI's head or from a dictionary, but from the game you initiate. That's exactly Wittgenstein's point. Meaning equals use. Can you write me a poem? You are playing the creative game. What's the capital of Peru? You switch to Quizmaster mode. Tell me a joke. Now we're in entertainment. ChatGPT doesn't change, it's the game you switch. If we have language games and they have rules, does that mean miscommunication, awkward moments and misunderstandings happen simply because people fail to follow those rules? Deliberate rule breaking, such as consciously define expectations, irony and sarcasm, puns and wordplay, or metaphors where words break their usual rules, is actually a sign that someone understands the game so well they can afford to bend the rules on purpose. And in doing so, they create something new. Mistakes or awkwardness, on the other hand, are unintentional violations. Wittgenstein described two kinds of such situations. The first is confusion, which arises from mixing games together. To see what he meant, we need to look at the context Wittgenstein was working in. As I mentioned earlier, philosophy and science in the early 20th century were searching for a perfect language, a tool that could solve their problems once and for all. In his philosophical investigations, Wittgenstein writes, "What is your aim in philosophy? To show the fly the way out of the fly bottle." The confusion that traps the fly in the bottle comes from the philosophy's attempt to build a perfect language by ripping words out of the games where they actually belong. Take, for example, the word faith. In the scientific game, it means a hypothesis grounded in data. In the religious game, it means trust in God. In everyday conversation, it can mean I believe the bus will arrive on time. If these contexts are mixed up, confusion arises. A classic case of such confusion is the philosophical question, but can religious faith be proven? The second type of breakdown comes from differences in forms of life. In simpler terms, the social and cultural background of the people involved in the conversation. The core problem is that the rules of language games are never written down. They exist as unspoken agreements within a given community. A good example is Khrushchev's famous remark at the UN: "We will show you Kuzka's mother." For Russian speakers, this is an idiomatic expression, basically meaning "we'll show you." A threat, yes, but one with a slightly cocky, even half-humorous tone. Western translators, however, took it literally, producing a mix of horror and bewilderment. What is this Kuzka's mother supposed to be? Interestingly, when it comes to interacting with ChatGPT, you might expect that problems would mostly stem from differences in forms of life. In practice, most awkward moments actually come from mixing games. For example, a user might write, "Tell me about Plato," expecting a short school-style summary, but instead receives a detailed academic overview. Or the opposite, they ask a scientific question, but get an answer in a popular science tone. This happens because ChatGPT can play many games, but the user hasn't specified the rules. So during the prompt, ChatGPT guesses the game and sometimes gets it wrong. Differences in social and cultural contexts do appear as well. ChatGPT doesn't have a form of life in the human sense, but it does have a training background, the massive corpus of books, articles, dialogues, and internet content it was trained on. And if you ask ChatGPT what cultural background that corpus leans toward, it would say that the majority of it comes from the contemporary West. which means its answers will naturally gravitate toward a Western, liberal, scientific and rational worldview. Take DeepSeek, for example. It's trained on a very different corpus of texts. And here we can really talk about a difference in forms of life. Unlike ChatGPT, which is mostly trained on an Anglo-centric mass of texts, DeepSeek is also richly trained on Chinese language sources. That means its cultural, cognitive and technical background will inevitably diverge from ChatGPT's. Consider the word freedom. In ChatGPT's training data, the dominant context is the Western philosophical and political tradition. Here, the emphasis tends to fall on freedom from oppression, censorship, violence. In fact, within the English language corpus, the word freedom almost automatically pulls toward a liberal political frame. With DeepSeek, the presence of so many Chinese texts shifts the nuance. In classical Chinese thought, Confucianism, Taoism, freedom is framed as freedom within order, harmony with the Tao or with society. In contemporary political and cultural discourse, the focus often shifts toward freedom too, the freedom to develop oneself, to learn, to serve society. It's less about rights against the state and more about opportunities within the community. As a result, DeepSeek is more likely to interpret freedom as the capacity to act in harmony, rather than a personal autonomy at any cost. ChatGPT pushes us to rethink what it means to understand, to think, and to realize. Because it can sustain a language game, we project agency, intent, even consciousness onto it. It imitates participation in dialogue so convincingly that it has become a genuine philosophical phenomenon. But maybe, when studying ChatGPT, we should take Wittgenstein's approach, stop asking what ChatGPT is, and focus on what it does. What game are you playing when you talk to AI? Drop your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more mind-bending ideas from philosophy, tech and beyond.